So again, welcome. This is our little winery, and we have you can see we're starting harvest, so it's getting a little crazy in here. But this is Michael. He is our winemaker, and he's going to be walking you through the process today of how to start making fruit wine. So I'm going to turn him over to be the host and shut myself up.
Hello. So this is something that John and I have talked about a couple of times about having or helping a lot of the fruit growers in the neighborhood how to make wine out of their stuff, out of their fruit and everything. So this is how I go about making my fruit wines. I don't do it very often because I primarily do grapes for our professional winery. But there's a lot of people who really enjoy a fruit wine and have lots of fruit and would like to learn how to do it. So we put this little demonstration together to help show people how to make wine out of your homegrown fruit. One of the things that I emphasize more than some of the block recipes is that I want to go through and use up as much of the fruit that you have laying around from your tree. You have a plum tree and it's just loaded full of plums, and the recipe says use 15 gallons or 15 pounds of fruit for so many gallons. Well, my approach, and this makes it very intense fruit wine, and over time you can make some changes to it so it's not as intense. But if you're going to have a plum wine, you want it to taste like plums. You want it to smell like plums. So this here is what I'm going to be using as a demonstration. This is raspberries. So it started out with 50 pounds of frozen raspberries. Most of them, about a third of them came from our yard, and the rest I bought as frozen berries, just because I wanted enough volume to make this thing work. So when they all thawed out, it came out to about 6 gallons of juice and pulp. So in that, this is going to be a raspberry wine that when you pour it in a glass, you will be able to smell raspberries before it even gets close to your face. And when you go to taste it, there's going to be no doubt in your mind that this is raspberries. And this is what you're going to want to do with your peaches, your plums, apples, or anything else like that you just have a lot of excess fruit. Use it all. Use as much as it can go, put it into a container, and you work from there. I'm almost getting worried that I don't have enough headspace left in this bucket for when I pitch the yeast. But so when I got this and it finally thawed and warmed up, one of the things you want to do is make sure you throw pectic enzyme in it pretty as it's thawing out, because that helps break down all the pectins. It helps break down all the pulpy goop, so that when you run a hydrometer, it's a lot easier. You can't have a lot of heavy solids in your sample, otherwise you'll get a false reading on Brix level or how much sugar you have. So one of the first things I did after pitching the enzyme and letting it all warm up, I took a sample, made sure the sediments settled out of the sample, and I got a pH reading. And the pH reading on that when I first got it was 3.09, which is pretty acidic, which I expected. A lot of the fruit you get, especially if you end up buying store-bought fruit, is they pick it green and then let it ripen on its own, and you don't get the sugars in it that you normally would at tree ripe. So, yes. This is my regular peach.
Yeah, how they might have.
Well, it's berry. So the pH meter This one's been recalibrated today, but every time you use your pH meter, you're going to want to recalibrate it kind of as often as possible. This isn't very clarified, but it will work. That's back down to 317. A little high, that's a little lower than what I originally wanted. So the slowest and hardest part about this whole process is the fact that you want to get your acid adjusted as best you can from the get-go. So most wines are made from a pH of around 3.1 on the low end, 3.1, and 3.8 or 3. You want to stay below 4, 4.0, then that's not enough acid in your wine. And so you want to be somewhere around 3.2, 3.3 to have a good acid balance. That gives it that crispness when you drink the wine. And if it's too high, if the pH is too high, you don't have enough acid in it, and it's kind of flat because there's not a little bit of an edge to it like most wines have. So the first thing you got to do is balance out the acid, and then I did that by slowly adding water to it, about a couple of liters at a time, till I got the pH in the range that I wanted. And this is always going to be a moving target because as things break down and mix things up, the pH is, every time you do something to it, something's going to change. So you get it zoned in as close as you can. Once you get that established, then, and that particular sample we did wasn't strained, it wasn't, so there's all this other stuff with it. But so I'm working on getting this to 3.2, and then once you get that in that range, and that's a fairly large range, 3.1 to 3.8, that's getting too far out of the range. But once you get that done, now, and you've watered it down enough, this one started out at 10.5 bricks with the original juice. But after adding about a little over 3 gallons of water to lower the pH, or bring the pH up, the bricks went from 10 down to 6.5. Well, 6.5 bricks isn't going to make you a very strong wine. So now we have to add sugar to bring that up. And there's a couple of different formulas. The one I particularly have, is 1.34 ounces of sugar for each gallon will raise that 1 gallon up 1 brick. And a brick is basically a percentage of sugar. So when you hear grapes were at 29 bricks or 25 bricks for the juice, that grape has 25% sugar in it. And that's what the alcohol breaks down, or the yeast break down into sugar, or alcohol, sorry. So anyway, this batch, by the time I added the water, I was up to 9 gallons. So I took 1.34 ounces, multiply it by 9, that's the number of gallons, and I needed 12.16 ounces to increase it by 1 brick. Well, I want the bricks around 21, and it's at 6, so I need to increase it by 14.5 bricks. So so after I get the 12.6, I then multiply that by 14.5. That means I have to add 174.87 ounces of sugar to this, and you can use granulated or corn sugar, and a lot of the beer makers and other wine makers really like corn sugar. You can use granulated sugar. I don't, they're pretty close in the way you measure them out and use them. The corn sugar dissolves a lot quicker and easier when you add it in. Regular granulated sugar takes a lot longer for it to dissolve into that batch. And so the yeast will eventually break it down and utilize it, but granulated sugar takes a little longer. Corn sugar is a little faster, and that is available at John's. Anyway, so I broke the 174.87 ounces divided by 16. That gave me 10.9 pounds. So I basically have to put 11 pounds, close to 11 pounds of sugar in that bucket to bring the bricks up to about 21. It seems like a huge amount, but like I said, grapes, when you ferment them, are around 24 25% sugar, and that's what you got to bring this one up to, at least 20, 21, 22 bricks, somewhere in there. It doesn't have to be perfect, just get it in there close. And then once that's all done, make sure you can still fit it in your container, because if I had to add any more stuff to this, so when I brought it up, the water brought it up to 9. Putting the sugar has brought it up almost to 10 gallons on here. You can see the marks I have there. And so that means that much sugar took up a gallon's worth of volume.
Can you show how to measure sugar? Bricks?
Oh, the bricks? Yes. So when you can get good, clean juice, I use the hydrometer. It seems to be a little more accurate for doing this. Now I need to have this juice settled out more for this to work. The other thing that you can use is called a refractometer. They're not that expensive, but they're kind of a cool toy to have. And so what this actually does is I'll take a droplet of the juice, put it on the screen, you flip it over. And when you look through this thing through the light, you will see a very dark blue horizon and a light horizon. And where that line is will tell you what the bricks are, or depending upon how your height or refractometer works. What it does, it's measuring the way light is refracted through sugar, and then it's projected across a stream or a scale inside of here, and that will tell you pretty close what your bricks are. And so this one I've gotten it up to about 22 or 20, about 21. I'm going to have to let this take another reading tonight, but I am going to show you about pitching the yeast and other stuff you need to do. Okay. So the hydrometer is $5.95. Yeah, the hydrometer and test jar at John's is $5.95 each. That's about the price. So about $49 for a refractometer. Nice thing is if you're taking your juice, or if you have your homegrown fruit with this, you can take little samples of it out in the yard, put it on there, flip it over, and you can see where your local fruit or your fruit in your yard is by taking little spot samples in your yard, and oh, it could be riper or not. So you can monitor your ripeness of your fruit at home with one of these as to how it's progressing. So in the past, I try to leave as much of the fruit whole as possible. You want this character from the skins. You want the only thing I'll do is, especially like with apples and pears, is remove the seeds, because the seeds do have trace amounts of cyanide. Yeah, cyanide. And in the seeds. And so I will core apples and freeze them but I won't necessarily peel them. And then you can either press them out to get just juice, or you can ferment them, the whole thing, all together. And when you do that, you get one of these big mesh bags that fit. And John's got multiple sizes of these mesh bags. And the advantage of that is when things are done, you can just slowly lift up and drain all you'll have left is the goop. And that will slowly drain out. And when you're done, you just have a lot less cleanup to do afterwards using mesh bags to pull everything out. Right now, it's really hard because it's all a lot of solid pulp, a lot of seeds, everything. But after the yeast gets done, all of that heavy thickness gets dissolved.
Michael,
yes.
comment type. Beginner first. The terms and numbers are a little confused, so you kind of want that. And maybe tell people if they're doing a hydrometer test what they need to look at.
So when you're looking at a hydrometer test, the one that John will be selling and the one that most people have, and there's other ones, this is the triple scale hydrometer. And so you have one side that has potential alcohol by volume, percent sugar balling, and then the other one is specific gravity. And the specific gravity is set up to where one is, let's see, specific gravity, yeah, one is water, basically is what water would be at, or in balling, percent sugar would be 0. And sugar is more dense than water is, so the more sugar that's in it will push this thing up and show you on here. So if you had 25 bricks, your percentage of alcohol or your specific gravity would be 1.102 on specific gravity, and 25 bricks would be 25% sugar in your must. And then you look over here and you can look on the scale, and I don't know if you can see it, but it would put it down to around 13.5% alcohol by the time it's done fermenting. So with the early stages, you can kind of tell those two things, where it's at, and how much potential alcohol you'll have at the end.
So we try to show on bricks or gravity for a sweet wine.
So the idea is, okay, alcohol is a little bit lighter, less dense than water is. And so technically, as the yeast converts all the sugar, which is more dense than water, and turns it into alcohol, that now that solution is going to be actually lighter in density than water. And so to know that your wine has gone completely dry, your hydrometer should almost sink below the 1 or the 0. And that's indicating that it is done. And usually your biggest indicator that your wine is done, it stops bubbling and all the solids have fallen off. And then a sweeter wine would be where you have a brick or two left, so it would be 1 brick or so above, or just, 1 brick would be left, would give your wine a little bit of sweetness. And my recommendation, that means you would have to try and stop the fermentation, which usually happens with freezing. And when you freeze it, you got to have quick control. It's easier to back sweeten for a home winemaker to make their wine a little sweeter. And then when you do that, you're going to want to have to use sorbate. And that helps, the sorbate helps prevent bacteria and yeast from reinitializing, because once you put bacteria or yeast food back in there, if there's any signs of yeast spores left in the wine, they will instantly start activating, and they will gobble up the sugar that you just added. And if you bottled it right away, you will be blowing corks. You'll be wondering why all of a sudden there's sticky all over the floor and empty bottles in your rack. And I've been through that, and no fun. So let's see, what else is there?
What all do you have in the raspberry right now? You already put the pectic enzyme.
The pectic enzyme's already in there, the sugar's in there, and it's been watered down. I have Go Firm measured out.
Do you do any kind of Camden Tablets or like that sanitized much?
No, because it's been so cold the whole time.
Question.
Oh. So I was asked if I put Camden Tablets in. So Camden Tablets is a prepackaged tablet of SO2 that's sulfiting it. A lot of people will do that, especially if you got picked up a lot of fruit off the ground, and there's all sorts of other stuff. That what you could do is anyway. So that helps keep a yeast or other bacteria from starting until you are ready to pitch your yeast. I personally make a 10% solution of sulfite, and then I measure it out in milliliters and add it and stir it in. To me, it's quicker and easier than calculating how many tablets you put. And all you have to do is get powdered form of sulfite, and you sell the powdered form as well. And so then it's just a matter of, 10% solution is 100 grams of powdered metted bisulfite with a liter of water, stir it up, and then put it in a container. And I usually just use these bottles with screw caps on them, and it's good for a couple of months. And at this time of the year and throughout the year, I go through this stuff fairly, just because I have a large volume that I am monitoring and taking care of all the time.
Michael, question. Do you recommend sodium or potassium at a bisulfite?
I have a Winemaker magazine had an article on that, and they were leaning away from the sodium metted bisulfite and leaning toward potassium. And I don't remember everything in the article of the argument pro and against, but the standard is with most, I think, in the beer industry and the wine industry, is potassium metted bisulfite.
That's primary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to find. I don't think I've seen the sodium metted bisulfite that available. I'm sure it is. I just haven't.
And can you repeat, how much did you add to the must? How much sulfite did you add to the must?
I didn't put any in my must this time around because it was so cold the whole time. Like I said, it was 50 pounds of frozen berries. It took several days for it to thaw. In fact, I had to stick it outside in the sun before the smoke came to warm it up so I could do something with it.
So most common for home winemaking would be one Camden tablet. You can make crushed up and some small amount.
Yeah, I don't do the tablet, so I don't remember what. So it's one tablet per 5 gallons.
And is it after fermentation?
Prior.
Yeah, prior, when you first have like warmed up fruit, before you throw the yeast in, and this protected like all of my cab sauv that I got yesterday. You put in, I put in 20 parts per million. Some people put in all the way up to 50 parts per million of sulfite in the buckets, just so that overnight something else doesn't take over. And then by the time you get around and back mixing up your Go Firm and your yeast and pitch it, then it has weakened down and enough to where the yeast that you're introducing in a large batch will overrun anything else. So that's the reason for adding some sulfite prior to the yeast. But you don't want to do it just before you do it. This is what you do the night before or whatever while you're waiting for temperatures to equalize and preventing other yeast that are not as favorable or flavorful or bad bacteria. So so now I just poured some water into here. The volume of water is not overly critical, but it depends upon how much yeast and go-firm and everything you're throwing in. This happens to be about 250 milliliters of water. This was 11 and a quarter grams of go-firm. And well, I was getting there. The go-firm. Go-firm is a yeast hydration nutrient. So you have these, and in these little packets, you have these little yeast spores that have been dehydrated, and you're now wanting to hydrate them and throw into your batch. And this is nutrients so that as they are opening and forming, they have the needed elements, vitamins, minerals, and other resources. There's ground up yeast hulls, so they have building material to start growing and expanding right away. People who make bread and use yeast, you have your sugar, you have flour, all these things that yeast can use to grow. When you're just rehydrating it in water, there's nothing in the water for them to really utilize. So you add a yeast nutrient, they will grow much faster and expand. So after you add it to warm water, and the water is usually just above tap temperature, or lukewarm temperature, it helps the stuff dissolve a little better. And then you want usually let this sit for a little bit to get for the water to saturate into all the go-firm, and then you wait until the temperature comes down. The temperature's already come down on this one. And then these are 5 gram packets. So typically, and this is the yeast I'm using, EC 1118. EC 1118 is a workhorse yeast. It's what you'll find in the majority of wine kits. If you buy a wine kit, I know Cellar Craft that's their main one. There's several other wine kits, companies, and I don't know exactly what they use, but I do know that Cellar Craft uses this particular yeast. And there's a lot of other yeast you can work with. You can go online, you can look at other resources to find different yeasts that do different things, and it's very common in winemaking to have different yeasts.
2 questions.
Yes.
Are you using boiled or purified water?
I'm using tap water, but here in Edgewood, our water has no chlorine, no fluoride, nothing is added to our water here, but it does have a little bit of calcium. And so if you live in an area that has a lot of chlorine and a lot of fluoride and all that, those will have an impact on your wine down the road. So when you're doing your yeast, if you're adding other nutrients, it would be best to use distilled water. You don't really need to boil it. You gotta have this whole little microorganism thing going on, and there's already stuff floating around in the air. And what you're doing is by hydrating this yeast and dumping it in after it's expanded, is you're going to overwhelm anything else that should be going on in there with this. So that's the idea.
And then another question. What if you're working with only foraged fruit? Will the natural yeast be enough with the pitch yeast to get it going for small batches? So I'm assuming, I think the question is, you need to add those.
Go firm is what you could add it directly to. So there are some recipes where they say just sprinkle the yeast on top, and you can do that, but your level of activation is slower by hydrating it this way. And basically all I do is stir this up, sprinkle this in, and you want to do about, on average, is 1 gram per gallon. So this is 9 gallons, almost 10 after adding sugar. And adding a little extra yeast is not going to hurt it, because all of this yeast is going to keep expanding exponentially as you go. So, and then you just let it sit, and in a little bit, when we go back to it, this is all going to be bubbling.
Can I make a comment back to Gordon's question? So in the case of foraged fruit, also, you would usually have killed off any of the natural yeast, the wild yeast, either via Camden Tablets or potassium metabisulfite mix or freezing in some way. So really, then you're only going to be dealing with the pitched yeast and not have any natural yeast remaining. To answer specifically, which yes.
Yeah, I wasn't totally getting you. I'm not, like I said, I'm dealing with grape salt the majority of the time, but
the Go Firm is really an aid to rehydrate yeast and getting the most out of that yeast pack.
Exactly. And so the yeast packet comes, 5 grams, 8 grams, depending on who you're getting it through or how you're getting it. I buy it in 500-gram packets, so I get these small little bricks, and I'll use them over, a year or two. So it will carry over, but I reseal the packages up really good. I fold them up nice and tight and tape them down again. And they go into the refrigerator until I need them again. If your yeast is a couple of years old, it doesn't hurt to double the amount of yeast that you're using just in case it's not fully active, because again, that little pack, those 2 little packets, that yeast is just going to keep multiplying until it hits the critical level, and then it just starts chewing away the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So it's putting a little extra yeast in is never going to hurt, because all it's going to do is help speed things up. So some of the other things I wanted to talk about. So for me, the most time-consuming thing about doing this was getting the pH right, because it took multiple tries at figuring out what it was. And like I said earlier, getting that pH level in the zone is probably, to me, one of the most critical things in the beginning, because like I was saying, if it's way too acidic, it does affect the yeast. They can't grow very well in 3 or below. But 3.1 is like the lowest level that yeast want to tolerate. And then if it goes too high, if you're close to 4.0, then you leave the door open to a lot of other yeast and spoilage bacteria that can easily take over when you're done with the primary fermentation. They will easily jump in there and take over.
So once the pH is adjusted with water and you add the sugar, you go back and recheck the pH?
Yes, I've gone back and that's why I said it's kind of a moving target. It can take me a day and a half to get this thing balanced out to where I want and get it into those brackets. And this is not a super hardcore science. You have fairly large size margin of error. So you don't have to be, like I said, 3.1 to 3.9 is fairly decent bracket, but the closer you are to 3.2, 3.3, the better. Your sugar level should be close to 21, 22. You go too much higher than that, then your wine gets a little too hot. And the yeast don't like sugar levels that are much higher than 26, 27 is pretty much their limits. Because once you get to 16, 15% alcohol, the yeast will die off. And if there's still sugar for them to consume, then that sugar is left for somebody else, for another microbial to come in and do it, unless you somehow, either you have to really sulfite it heavy, or you have to hit it with sorbate, potassium sorbate, to help limit other things happening.
So you check the acid. So the pH does basically, but it's different than total acid. You don't
Right.
check pH.
So I used to get really hung up on having both the pH and the total acid. It's actually titratable acid is what TA is. And in the industry, you're looking, in the grape wine industry, you're looking at tartaric acid, because that's the primary acid in grapes. In fruit wines, such as apples and pears, malic acid is the primary acid in apples and pears. Malic being with mallow, it's part of that group. Some fruits have citric acid as its primary, but I don't worry so much about the titratable acid, because the majority of what you're doing is more pH driven, not necessarily the type of acid. If you need to add acid, then so if you water it back further, most of the acids you buy for fruit wines, it's called an acid blend. What they basically did is blended malic acid, tartaric acid, and citric acid in the acid blend, because that way it kind of covers whatever you're doing. It's a nice blend to supplement whatever fruit or whatever you're adding to. In winemaking, I strictly use tartaric acid if I want to increase the acid, which I'll do to some of my white wines if the pH is off. Fruit wines, if you water it down too much, because you just wanted to make a bigger batch, which is fine, but you need to use the acid blend, stir it in really good, and make that get the pH back down to where it belongs. Because if it comes, like I said, if it comes up too high, then you end up with a really flabby wine. It doesn't have that zing to it, and it's may have fruity flavor, but you drink it, and it's just like, yeah, okay. So this is by having it in that pH range. That's what I've always wondered or worried about, because how much sulfite you put into a wine, how much, what your yeast tolerance is, it's all pH driven. So that's what I focus
The higher acid, the less.
on. Correct. So, your sulfiting is pH driven. Winemaker Magazine has a sulfite calculator that they have in their resource tab. And basically, the lower the pH is, the less sulfite you need to put into your wine. And it's hard to describe without going into a whole lot of chemistry and everything else. But the curve is quite severe in the beginning, and like I said, the amount of 10% solution I have to put into a wine, keep it preserved and nobody noticing that there's sulfite in it, in a 3.2 wine is probably only a few milliliters per gallon, versus one that is closer to 3.8. I have to add probably 4 or 5 times much 10% solution to cover that same wine. So it's, like I said, it's very pH driven, and that's why I really like everything in that 3.2, 3.3 range, because it means I have to do less monitoring and have to worry about other microbials taking over.
You'll be doing in the next couple weeks.
So as you can see, look in there, you can see that it's only been in there for a little bit, but now you can see CO2 bubbles forming up on the top. When I'm doing this, I'm paying a lot more attention to the temperature and everything else. And with the water cooled down a little bit more than I expected, but it eventually this thing will foam way up here. And when that's done, when that's foaming up really good, and you want to make sure there's not more than 18 degrees difference between the temperature of your must and the temperature of your yeast. And right now, this batch has already cooled down quite a bit, so I know it's very close to what the raspberries are.
Once fermentation is done, if you're using a bag to dispense fruit, you're concerned about oxidation.
Yes, once you know that everything is done, well, a good example, you take the juice, once you get all the juice squeezed out of the bag and all the crud and you throw that away, there's still a lot of dead yeast, a lot of other miscellaneous things that went through the bag that's going to be there. So what you're going to do is move it over into a carboy and what you're going to do is get a bung with a hole that has a hole in the top. You put this in, and there's a little mark in here, and you're going to want to fill this up with some people fill it up with vodka. Some people fill it up with a 10% solution or a 1% sulfite solution. And you'll put that on there and it'll bubble. And what will happen is you're degassing it, but you want to make sure everything is there, it's completely done. Even though it seems like it's done there, things are still going to go on here. And so you're going to want to put this bubbler on there and let it degas and let any yeast and everything go until it's done. And you'll know it's totally done when you start seeing at the bottom of the carboy, you will see a brownish layer start forming, and that is the dead yeast cells drifting to the bottom. And some of that is they were in suspension because they were attached to a molecule of CO2, which was keeping them suspended. But as the CO2 breaks loose from that, everything slowly starts settling down. And then you'll really know when this thing stops bubbling and you have a nice thick layer of gunk at the bottom. Then it's time to wrap this from this carboy into another one. And a lot of times you end up going to a slightly smaller carboy, or you find ways to fill it up a little. So if you've got sterile glass, there's glass beads that you can put in there to help bring up the volume a little bit. Some people have little glass, solid chunk glass rods they put in there. At this time, you could also put an oak stave in there to help take up the volume if you don't have it. Or if you notice that your wine is super strong and you want to tone it down a little bit, now's the time you could add a little bit of water in it to help bring up the neck so that you lose the airspace and modify it that way. But at that point, when you rack it off of all the crud, that is when you want to put your crush your Camden tablet, or use a 10% solution and add it to the new carboy and rack it from there, from the old one into the new one, and that will help with the oxidation. And then you want to keep this as close to the top as possible to keep your airspace to a minimum. And that keeps your oxygen contact with the juice or the wine at that point to a minimum.
Could we also top up with sterile juice for wine?
Yes,
Say that.
you could top it off. So the thing is, could you top it off with sterile juice or wine? So if you want to sweeten it up a little bit, you could back sweeten it with a little bit of a simple syrup or a little water sugar mix if you want to sweeten it up, or you can, if you have an old bottle of wine from some other project you've done, you could do that. With the fruit wines, there's really no rules. A friend of ours did an apricot wine, and she blew everybody away because everyone's going, "What is that? What did she put in for wine?" We couldn't figure. She put almond extract, just a couple of drops of almond extract in with her apricot wine, and anyway, she put a little bit of almond extract in with her apricot wine, and it was phenomenal. So with country wines, you're not labeled down to a whole lot of rules. It's kind of like the free range of beer making right now. You can try all sorts of different combinations. Say you don't have enough of one type of fruit, or you have a large berry patch, but it's all multiple berries. Freeze them all and put them all together in one big batch, and you can have a 4 or 5 berry blend of stuff.
Two things.
Yep.
If you're using powdered potassium sulfite, can you share how to get a 10% solution? It's as simple as 90 grams of water to 10 grams of potassium.
Yeah. So I've made myself this little cheat sheet because I got tired of looking it up in the book. So for a 10% solution, it's basically 100 grams per liter, or 50 grams for 500 milliliters, or 10 grams for 100 milliliters is a 10% solution. So you come up with the water, throw in the metabisulfite, and volume change in the water is minimal, and that gives you your basic 10% solution. I use a 1% solution. That's this other little bottle here, and that I use for quick sanitizing. So if I've got something that I need, a piece of equipment that I haven't used for a long time, I will take a little of that, put it in the container, swirl around, get a paper towel, wipe it all the way around and through, and that will sanitize that quickly, as opposed to some of the other sanitizers where you have to let it sit for 2 to 3 minutes to sanitize your equipment. But it's a little harsh on your lungs when you're breathing the sulfite all the time. So I try not to do that unless it's a quick emergency.
So how much 10% solution per gallon crack?
So back to my little cheat sheet. I have 30 parts per million and 50 parts per million already written out. So for 1 gallon, for 30 parts per million, it's 2 milliliters per gallon. For 50 parts per million, it is 3.33 milliliters per gallon.
What was the first one?
2.0 milliliters
per gallon?
Per gallon of 10% solution. And so a lot of times if I'm going through with my wine, a lot of my wines need to be pretty close to that 30 parts per million or a little less. I do have some wines that are close to like the 3.6, 3.7. I have to go closer to the 50 parts per million. So I went with 30 and 50, and then I extrapolate in between the two.
What was it, 50?
50 was 3.33 milliliters per gallon. And then I have it broken down so that if I have 7 gallons, I look straight across and I know how much they have. But a lot of times if you run it and you haven't checked your wine for a while, and I have with this little gizmo here, I can test my own sulfite, my own pH, TA, all that with that either gizmo, or you can buy the equipment separately for that stuff. But when you check it, you want to keep it in the bracket, and you don't. So some winemakers just follow the recipe that they've been given. It's like every month they throw a Camden Tablets. Well, if you were very diligent and you're making sure everything was sterile, you keeping the O2 off of your wine, and so it's not oxidizing or anything like that, then you're going to be over sulfiting it over the time. If you're not as diligent and you do have bigger headspace, not monitoring it as well as you should, you following that recipe, you could actually still be under sulfiting it and end up with a spoiled thing. And there's a little gizmo. I don't have one right now, but it's based off of a Ripper method. It's a little capsule that you break. I've only used it once, and then after that, I got the equipment to do it because it does a much better job. But for a home winemaker, this can give you a fairly accurate estimate or accurate measurement of how much free SO2 you have in your wine, so you don't over sulfite it or under sulfite it. If you over sulfite it, all you do is you open up the bottle and it smells like burnt matches for a while. They'll burn off after a while, but it takes a while, so you don't. It's not a pleasant smell. It'll burn the tip of your nose a little bit, but if you undersulfite it, you run the risk of your wine getting oxidized and other, like turning it to vinegar or any of these other things that can happen if it's not treated.
So we have about 5 minutes,
Okay.
or in this hour. And then, so what are you going to be doing in the next 1 to 2 weeks?
So
check your hydrometers.
yes. So right? Once I pitch the yeast and everything, tomorrow morning there will be a foamy cap on this thing. I'll stir it up on a regular basis.
Once, twice, okay?
2-3 times a day I'll stir it up, and then monitor after a couple of days. There's some other stuff you can add. It's Fermade O or Fermade K. You have that at your, so John's got that, and that's an additional yeast nutrient. So basically, what you're trying to do is let your yeast run this nice, easy race to the end, as opposed to giving them this uphill climb of scavenging nutrients to finish converting the sugar into alcohol. And so by adding the Fermade O or Fermade K, it's giving them this big meal halfway through the fermentation to help them finish on through. And you'll end up finishing out your fermentation a lot sooner. So in a week or two, this will be completely done. And then and we'll probably talk about having a second Zoom about what it's going to look like putting it into a carboy and all that. There was something else I was going to bring up in a.
You could mention about how we back to dry, we back using the hydrometer.
So so you can what we've done in the past, I've done a Riesling where I back sweetened it a little bit, and I had some others that I back sweetened a little bit, and where you take your finished wine and you add a little bit of sugar at a time and rehydrate and use the hydrometer to see where that you don't want it too far past, 1 brick, but you do it to taste, and you just keep adding a little bit of sugar at a time. There's formulas for it, but basically you're doing this to taste, and so what you want. And some people think they want a really sweet wine when they realize, oh, I only need a little bit of sweetness to make it more enjoyable. Nobody ever, I don't like a wine that is syrupy. And I've had some people's wine that were a little syrupy and they're just, you get burned out on them really quick. Oh, I know. The one thing I wanted to, there's a lot of people worried about sulfites and sulfite headaches and all that stuff. If you don't get a headache from bacon, you do not have an issue with sulfites. The things that could be in wine that could be giving you headaches that people are so worried about is actually histamines that are produced by both yeast and bacteria in a wine that will give people a headache. So don't be scared about using sulfites, because what we're trying to do is use the minimum amount of sulfite to protect the wine, and that's why monitoring their levels is very important. Is that it? Well, thank you very much.
All right.
If you hit.
Alrighty, I'll come in and talk just this way. Hi,
Come here,
everybody.
Leah.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope everything went okay on that end. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email either John or Michael. Again, John's actually got all the supplies you'd need to be doing this down at his store, John's Homebrew and Winemaking Supply. And we may actually, if people would find it interesting, we can do a follow-up call in about 2 weeks when this should be finished out, just to kind of go over, those processes. So if you're interested, we can do that. So thanks much, and I hope you enjoyed.